The rain had just stopped when Michael Turner, a 16-year-old kid from the south side of Atlanta, walked into the small diner on Maple Avenue. His shoes were wet, his backpack heavier than usual, and his eyes carried the tired look of someone who's had to grow up too early. Behind the counter, a woman in her 50s looked up. White apron, silver hair, and a name tag that said Carol. She smiled politely, but when she saw him hesitate near the door, her smile faded just a little. It was subtle, so small that if you weren't paying attention you'd miss it. But Michael didn't miss it. He'd seen that look before. He sat in the last booth by the window, ordered a black coffee, and pulled out his notebook. On the cover were his initials, MT. He liked writing, poems mostly. Words were safer than people. Outside, thunder grumbled far away. Inside, silence filled the room. Carol brought the coffee, set it down without meeting his eyes, and said, "You'll have to pay first, honey, just in case." Michael looked up slowly. Just in case what? She blinked, uncomfortable. "It's just policy." He nodded quietly, even though there was no sign on the wall, no rule written anywhere. He reached into his pocket, placed a $5 bill on the table, and said softly, "Keep the change." When she walked away, he stared at his reflection in the window, his brown skin against the pale light of the storm. He'd gotten used to this feeling, being seen but not looked at. The bell above the diner door rang. An older man walked in, George Bennett, the local sheriff, uniform pressed, badge shining. Everyone in town respected him. Everyone but Michael. George stopped when he saw the boy. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Michael nodded. "Afternoon, sir." "Where you from, son?" "Down on Willow Street." George narrowed his eyes. "That's the neighborhood where that break-in happened last week, ain't it?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I was at school." The sheriff's hand hovered near his belt. "You got an alibi?" Carol's voice broke in nervously. "He's just having coffee, George." But George wasn't listening. He took a step closer. "Show me your bag." Michael hesitated. He could feel every heartbeat echoing in his chest. The room went silent again. That kind of silence that makes you feel smaller than you are. He slowly opened his backpack. Inside, notebooks, pencils, a worn-out library book, and a letter folded neatly in the front pocket. The sheriff pulled it out before he could stop him. It was addressed to Dear Dad. George opened it, read a few lines, then froze. "I don't know how to stop people from hating what they don't understand. I just hope I don't become like them. Mum says you used to tell her that anger makes the world smaller. I think I get it now." The sheriff lowered the paper. His eyes softened just a little. "Where's your dad, son?" Michael looked at him. "In a cemetery off Jefferson Road." For the first time, George didn't have anything to say. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the boy's bag, and said, "You should head home before it gets dark." Michael nodded, gathered his things, and left the diner without a word. Outside, the rain had started again. Slow, steady, quiet. He walked past the courthouse, past the gas station, down to the old bridge by the river. That's where his father used to bring him as a kid. They'd sit on the railing, tossing stones into the water. His dad always said the river didn't care what color you were. It just carried you forward. Michael sat there for a long time, watching the water move beneath him, wondering if that was still true. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Sheriff Bennett sat alone at the counter, his coffee untouched. Carol approached, unsure what to say. "You okay, George?" He nodded slowly. "You ever see a mirror and realize you don't like what's looking back?" Carol frowned. What do you mean? He didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. An old black and white picture of a younger him, smiling beside a man in uniform. His name was Henry Turner, he said quietly. Saved my life once. We served together. Carol blinked. Turner? You mean? George nodded. Michael's father. The bell over the door rang again. Rain blew in. George stood up, left a tip on the counter and said, I think I owe that boy something his father gave me a long time ago. Outside, thunder rolled again, but this time it didn't sound angry. That night, the rain fell harder, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, but demands it. The town slept quietly under the sound of thunder, but Sheriff George Bennett sat wide awake, his old badge glinting under the lamplight. He hadn't stopped thinking about the boy, about Michael Turner, and about the letter. On his desk sat that old photograph, him and Henry Turner, two young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder during a war that promised to make them equal, but never really did. He remembered the day Henry saved his life, how he dragged him out of the mud, bullets flying, refusing to leave him behind, even when others said it wasn't worth it. George had told himself for years that what came after wasn't his fault, that life just happened. But now, looking at the picture, he knew better. He'd come home, built a life, worn a uniform again. Henry hadn't, because the same town that saluted George had shut its doors on Henry. The next morning, George drove out to Willow Street. The houses looked old, tired, paint peeling, mailboxes dented. Kids played barefoot in puddles, laughing the way only children can. Too young to know what the world expects from them. He parked in front of a small blue house. A woman was sweeping the porch, Mrs. Turner, Michael's mother. She froze when she saw him. Her eyes, sharp and steady, said everything her mouth didn't. Mrs. Turner, George said quietly, hat in hand. I came to see your son. She didn't move. Why? You going to search his bag again? The words hit harder than a slap. He deserved them. No, ma'am, he said, just to talk. After a long silence, she opened the door. He's in his room, but if you're here to make excuses, save your breath. Michael was sitting on the bed, notebook open, headphones on. When he saw the sheriff, he stood up slowly. I don't want any trouble, he said. George shook his head. Neither do I. He hesitated. Your dad, Henry Turner, he saved my life once. Michael frowned. You knew my dad? George nodded. More than you'd think. He was braver than I ever was. He reached into his pocket and handed Michael the photograph. The young men in the picture looked like strangers to the boy, but the eyes, he recognized those, his father's eyes. I've spent a long time pretending I didn't know who I became after that war, George said. Your dad went home a hero, but this town never saw it that way, and I let that happen. Michael didn't say anything. He just looked down at the picture, tracing the edges with his thumb. After a moment, he asked, Why are you telling me this? George sighed. Because maybe if someone had told me the truth sooner, I would have been a better man. He looked around the room. Books stacked on the desk, a half-written poem on the page. I dream of rivers that forget the colors they carry. George's throat tightened. You write that? Michael nodded. Yeah, it's for my dad. The sheriff smiled faintly. He'd be proud of that. 2 days later, the diner on Maple Avenue looked the same as always. Same people, same music on the radio, same smell of fried eggs and coffee. But something had changed. When Michael walked in that morning, backpack on his shoulder, everyone turned to look. Not with hate, not with curiosity, just with silence. Carol froze behind the counter, unsure. Then George's voice came from the corner booth. "Coffee's on me, kid." The room stayed quiet as Michael sat across from the sheriff. "I owe you an apology," George said, "not just for that day. For every day I looked away when someone like me made someone like you feel smaller." Michael stirred his coffee, his expression unreadable. "You can't fix history, Sheriff." George nodded. "Maybe not. But maybe we can stop repeating it." He reached into his jacket pocket and slid something across the table, a folded piece of paper. "Your dad wrote this before he died. He wanted me to have it. I think it belongs to you now." Michael opened it. The handwriting was rough, but familiar. Strong, like the man himself. "If you're reading this, I hope you learn to forgive the world even when it doesn't deserve it. Some people never change, son. But if you keep walking with love in your hands one day, maybe it will." The boy's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. "He really wrote this?" George nodded. "He did. After the war, he wanted me to remember it. I didn't." Michael folded the paper carefully. "Then maybe it's time you do." The sheriff smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You sound like him." "Maybe that's a good thing," Michael said quietly. Later that evening, the bell above the diner door rang again. This time, it was Michael holding the door open. For Carol. She looked confused, hesitant. He smiled. "Ladies first." It was a small gesture, a quiet one. But it broke something invisible in that room, the kind of silence that had lived there too long. The next morning, the sheriff hung up his badge for good. He started volunteering at the local community center, reading poetry with kids who looked like Michael. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they argued, but they always listened. And on Fridays, he'd walk down to the bridge by the river. That same spot where Henry and Michael used to throw stones. He'd sit there, close his eyes, and listen to the water move beneath him. He finally understood what Henry meant all those years ago. The river doesn't care what color you are, it just carries you forward. A few years later, a poetry competition was held at the local high school. A senior named Michael Turner took the stage. He read a poem dedicated to his father. "I once met a man who carried guilt like a shadow. He taught me that silence has a color, and that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's survival. I've learned that some hearts take longer to wake up, but they still do." When he finished, the room stood and clapped. In the back row, George Bennett wiped a tear from his weathered cheek. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like new beginnings. Moral of the story: racism isn't just hate, it's silence, it's fear, it's the small things people let slide. But the moment one person chooses to see beyond color, the world changes its tone. Because love doesn't ask what you look like, it just asks if you're listening.